Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Tiger Talk this month. Some exciting things. I want to open with some updates and information about Marshall Public Schools for this month. We recently closed our new career and technical school. We're calling it the Marshall Career and Technical Institute. Really excited about that. It's on North Highway 59, and we'll be doing some CTE courses out at that location, looking at things like welding and automotive repair first. Those classes will open the fall of 2022 after doing some initial reconstruction of that site. And then some future expansion is going to take place, and we'll look at adding some things like certified nursing assistant at that site. That's a course that we currently offer at our alternative school that will move to the new CTE location. We'll also offer training in construction trades, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, that type of thing eventually down the road. So our program, we're really excited to get added, taking some things we just don't have the lab space at our high school right now to add, and add some additional programming at this new location out on North Highway 59. The other piece with that's going to happen, you'll see some changes happening within our middle school as we're doing some updates to our schedule there and trying to add some pathways courses building up towards those CTE programs at the middle school. So a lot of work taking place that we're excited about. I want to call out big congratulations to our fall teams this year. We had a lot of success with our fall teams. It was so much fun to be back in person. I know, Darci, you were at a lot of events and stuff this fall too, and getting to see our kids performing, and we had really successful teams. Our cross-country team took 4th place in the state tournament this year. Last week, our volleyball team took the state championship, so certainly some successes there. It was a pretty exciting way to end the first season back to having spectators and such events, and that was a lot of fun. Winter things are starting to take place too, which is hard to believe that it feels like winter today outside, but fall musical, it's that time of year as well. We've got the fall musical this year is Matilda. It's a popular, well-known play that our kids are doing. They've been working really hard on. Fun, family-friendly performance that's going to take place at the high school Performing Arts Center. The middle school kids and Southview students get to come over and watch us for a special preview on Friday on November 19th. That's going to be fun for those kids to get to see it. And a good trial for our high school kids, get to put on their performance for the younger kids. But then the public performances are Saturday, November 20th at 7:30 p.m. On Sunday, November 21st, a matinee at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then on Monday, the 22nd at 7:30 in the afternoon, we'll have performances of Matilda. So I encourage people to come out and check that out and see the work our fine arts students have been doing as well. Also want to call out, we finished a first full quarter of the school year. We had full instruction the whole time. I just can't believe how quickly each year goes. It feels like every year goes faster than the one before it. And all of a sudden here we are and first quarter is completely over. Parents should be watching for report cards and some final testing data and such. We're coming home, some NWA reports. If you haven't already gotten that stuff, that'll come at the end of the quarter here. So soon if you haven't gotten already. Winter activities, I want to call that out. We've got all those things started, so we got through the fall things. Winter things are starting. I'm looking forward to an exciting season with all of that for the Marshall Tiger activities. So basketball fans and wrestling fans and gymnastics fans and all those things, season's upon us. Last thing I want to call out for announcements is November 24th, starting November 24th, we have a noon dismissal, and then the 25th and 26th, we have Thanksgiving break for our students. So there'll be no school on those days, and then we look forward to coming back that following week back in school. But it's the end of that time, and it's transition time for everything. So. All right, those are my announcements for this time. I'm excited to welcome Darci Love with me this morning. Darci is our principal at Parkside Elementary, and Darci's here to talk about the science of reading, something that Darci's very passionate about. She presented to our board recently and talked about this, and Darci's even going back to school a little bit to learn a little more about that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background with this first, Darci, and then we'll get into what it is. But talk a little about your background with it and why this is so important to you.
Sure. So I've been in Marshall now for 8 years, and previous to this, I was the director of curriculum instruction in South Dakota, and then previous to that, I taught 8th grade social studies.
Sure.
And so throughout my entire educational career, I always wondered, like, how come we just can't seem to teach a core group of kids, whether that be 20%, 30%, the reading skills they need to be successful. Reading is the currency of our new world. Without reading, you are not going to be as well off moving forward. It's what allows us access to good jobs and to a good future. And so It's not a nice to have skill, it's a have to have. And so I've just really become, especially after becoming an elementary principal, we really set that foundation and lay that foundation. And when I first started, I probably didn't have as much reading background. And there has just been so much new research in terms of how students learn to read that as I started digging, a little bit more came and a little bit more came. And then I most recently enrolled at the University of Florida and I'm taking some coursework in dyslexia and language disorders.
To really understand that. I know we've talked a lot about the learning to read happens at your level, that kindergarten, first grade. It's so important we set that foundation because in the rest of their school career, they read to learn.
Right.
So really setting that foundation, everything else comes after this piece. And if we miss them, there's a gap there. And I know I've heard you talk about your passion with all kids learning to read as well, and really that foundational skills. Because sometimes we'll hear, well, the EL kids, that's different, or for our students with special needs, that's different, and it's not. These are skills that it's the same process for all kids. There might just be some other barriers or something, and part of this research you're doing, this work, is how to overcome barriers and provide the same learning to everybody.
Absolutely, and I think that education, even over the last 15 to 20 years, has kind of shifted to all kids can learn. I think prior to some of this research and scientific knowledge, we thought that people were born with a certain skill set, and then that's what you're born with what you get. Or is that right? You get what you're born with. There. You get what you were born with. And so what we're learning through the science of reading is that isn't necessarily true. That all kids, probably 95% of them with the right instruction, can learn to read. Certainly if they speak another language, there are some different things that we need to take into consideration. But with the right instruction and the right support, all of our kids can learn to read.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about science of reading. That's some terminology that we've talked about this year. So what does that mean? What is science of reading?
Anytime you talk educationally about certain things, science of reading, whatever it may be, everybody's like, oh, it's a fad. It's going to go away. We'll do it for a while, and then we'll go back. And so I think to answer that question, you have to kind of go back to what we knew about reading previously. And so previously, we thought that learning to read was either phonics, a lot of phonics instruction, or a whole language approach. Like just give kids, immerse them in wonderful texts, teach them to recognize words, and they'll automatically develop those skills. And so for a long time, that's kind of they call them the reading wars. They would go back and forth about what was more important, what was less important, how kids learn to read. And so the science of reading really has solidified this is how kids learn how to read, whether it's phonics or whole language. It's a little bit of a combination of those things, but through brain imaging and through the studies in multiple areas, cognitive, communication, developmental psychology, special education, through all of those sciences, they've kind of pulled all of that together to call what is now the science of reading. So it's a culmination of much research and many studies about how the brain learns to read.
Sure.
Yeah.
Not exciting to everyone, but for the elementary principal, it is exciting, right? So why, we understand what that is. Why is that important to think about all those pieces?
Yeah, it's important to think about all those pieces because certainly what I had just shared about, previously us thinking that you were born with a certain set of skills, this science shows us that everyone can learn to read. It is a complex task. And so as you learn to read, there is not a part of our brain. When we are born with a language-specific area in our brain. But there isn't a reading part of our brain. Reading is honestly a relatively new skill within the last 5,000 years. So as we developed communication and ways of communication, reading is what developed. And so our brains are now adapting to how to make meaning of printed words, text, materials, things like that. And so that process in our brain has many different areas and parts of the brain that have to be connected in order for that reading comprehension to take place. And so that's why it's so important to know what each of those parts of the brain do, how they function together, and then when our kids struggle, where are some possible areas that we need to be more clear about to help them make meaning of text.
Sure. And, it's interesting you bring that up. We look at some of our families that come to us in Marshall from a country and they're speaking English they're not speaking English at all yet, maybe at this time. And the language that they do speak, a lot of times we're seeing where it's a new enough language where the written language didn't happen. So there wasn't reading with that. So we're starting, they have language skills at a certain level, but the reading skills are non-existent because it wasn't even available in some of these languages. So when you look at that big picture and looking back historically, it's interesting to put all that together. So.
Right. Well, and certainly English in itself is a difficult language because of all of the irregularities, all of the sounds that are produced. And you think about there are, for example, Spanish. There are about 28 phonemes or sounds in the Spanish language, and there are 44 in English. And so that can even vary depending on dialect. And so a phoneme is like a sound that the language makes. So Spanish and English have some similarities, but when you start talking about Somali and Karen, a lot of those languages have very different phonemes and different sounds that don't relate to the English language. So again, that's where that complication arises, and we know that it needs to be very systematic. So you can't just start with looking and recognizing a word. You have to first start by what sounds do you hear? And so it really starts with that auditory process before we even start connecting it to a word or individual letters.
Sure. And that's where making that connection from the science of reading to the classroom level is so important, because some students' experiences will be so varied in that respect. So, so when you're working through this, I mean, we understand you're working on the degree and learning this yourself. How do you translate that for your teachers that maybe don't have that background so they can help the kids?
Yeah, and that is hard because when you talk about the science of reading, we're not talking about just a published book that says, here is all of that you need to know about the science of reading. It's hundreds of thousands of studies and publications that come together with a few set of things that we know about how they learn to read. And so what's difficult is unless you are completely immersed in that and do read a lot, it's hard because it is very different than probably what many of our teachers learned while they were going through their college prep programs. And so this is new information, and they're trying to learn it and implement some of those things along with where they're at right now, teaching every day and just trying to keep up with the demands of teaching. And so that is the difficult thing, is balancing that. How do you start learning all of this new information and then integrating it into your practice within the classroom? And so it will take some time for sure.
Yeah. So as you talk about taking time on the pieces they're learning, what does it look like? If I walk into a classroom at Parkside right now, what am I going to see for reading instruction? Because I think a lot of our viewers, it does look different than what it was when we were in school.
Yeah, for sure. So, and I even think back to when I was in school, and I didn't have a lot of phonics instruction. I had a lot of like the Dick and Jane books where you recognized whole words. And so we don't use those anymore, because one of the foundations that we have really learned is through the science of reading is that this all starts with the ability to decode. So the ability to hear the sounds of the language and then match that sound with a letter that is on the page. So we don't read whole words. We read, we put together the sounds that those letters make. So if you think about looking at a word on the paper, it doesn't matter what color it is, what font it is, how the size of it. We recognize the sounds that each of those letters make. So the premise behind the whole language was that you recognized the whole word at one time. Well, if that was true, then it would be more difficult to recognize when it was in a different font or a different color. So we went away from that type of reading to now really emphasizing the explicit and systematic instruction in decoding or in phonics. So first teaching hearing and manipulating sounds. So for example, if I said the word cat, what sounds do you hear in cat? K, a, t. I hear 3 sounds in cat. And so then taking that and saying, if I change the k to a b, what sound or what word do I have? B, a, t. So really helping them hear and recognize the sounds. And then once they're able to do that, connecting those sounds to a printed symbol or a letter.
Sure.
So that's the systematic, and then very explicitly teaching those things, not leaving it up to chance that they will get it, but being very explicit and systematic about it.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So when you talk about that, we know that all students don't come in with the same background knowledge or with the same ability at starting at whatever grade level it is. So how is that individualized for kids within the classroom? I know I've heard you talk about like guided reading and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yep. So they'll have like a whole group's phonics lesson, and then there certainly are going to be gaps and even times when our students need more practice or support with that same lesson. And so we have smaller guided reading groups where the teacher will review that phonics skill, but then also take those skills and apply them to a text of some sort.
Sure, which helps the teacher meet
Yes.
all the kids. We talk a lot in our schools about meeting the kids where they're at, so that's how the elementary teachers can do that.
Yes.
And then proceed from there and meet the benchmarks where it's most appropriate.
Right.
And I know I've heard you also talk about how data is such an important part of this. How does data play into all of that?
Yeah, for sure. And so just being very specific about what skills our students have and knowing that it's a process and it is hierarchical. There's a hierarchy. So you have a certain set of skills that you need first, and then each thing comes second. And so that data is so critical and important because we need to make sure that they have those other skills below, or they won't have those higher level skills. And so I think about even some of our kids who come to us with the ability to read. And so I worry about some of those kids because in second grade, let's say they seem to be very proficient, they can read words, but when we ask them to go back to the skills that are the foundation and to isolate those sounds, they're not able to do that. Not all of them, but there are some. But it's important for us to know that because they don't have a solid decoding system in place, and then we need to back up and assure that they have those decoding skills, because what happens is they rely on pictures and things within the text, and when they get older, there are not those supports to help them read those difficult words. So we really need them to have the ability to decode every word so that as they have an increasing difficulty of text, they're able to decode the words and make meaning of the text. So data plays an important part because without that, you won't know where those skills are and which ones they need more instruction in.
Right, we're not just throwing darts at what are we going to teach next. It's very specific about where is the student at and what comes next.
And I always equate that to going to the doctor. They shouldn't just guess what's wrong. They're going to take and run some tests and they're going to get some numbers and say these are the numbers that are right on and low and high, and then from there know what they need to do next. It's the same thing in teaching, and especially in reading, is we need those numbers and we need to know what the skills are that they need, and then we need to fill in those gaps.
Right, and there's a lot of different layers of tests. We talk about, at your level, not MCAs so much, but district-wide, we talk about those, NWAs, you talk about BAS assessments and phonological screeners and phonics tests and classroom tests and all those pieces, because they all play such a different role in determining where we're at. We have to do a screener to find kind of who's kind of at that benchmark, and that helps us make groups, but then specifically within the groups, what do we do? And then the other piece I want to talk about a little bit is it's, once we've got some of those groups determined, I mean, for one teacher to meet all those needs for all those kids, it's just not possible. So there's a lot of support things in place at your school. Can you talk a little bit about some of those extra support people that help the classroom teachers make this happen?
Sure, absolutely. And so in our kindergarten classrooms, we have kindergarten aides. Those kindergarten aides then during those small group times work with individual students at the direction of the teacher. So the teacher will say, today, here's what I need you to do with these groups of students. And so again, that differentiating and identifying students' needs is so important, but then you also need someone in there to help with that differentiation, because you're right, one teacher to differentiate for that many students is very hard.
Right.
So we have them, and then we also have our reading interventionists. And so our reading interventionists, we have what is called a data meeting 3 times a year. So we take all of our students and we look at where they're at, and if they're meeting benchmarks or if they're below those benchmarks, it's how are we going to provide intervention and support to them so that we can get them where they want to be. And so a big part of that is our reading interventionists, and they work specifically with our kids who are farthest from those benchmarks and need an additional set of instruction for those foundational skills.
Sure.
We also have EL teachers and SPED teachers who attend those data meetings to help know what exactly it is that those students need to help support their learning.
Right.
So.
The only other one I think we should mention is the instructional coach, because that's a big one too.
Yes, absolutely. So we have several. We have one at Parkside, there's one at Southview, there's one at the middle school, and they're instructional coaches. And so right now for our level anyway, she primarily focuses on reading instruction. And so we had talked about earlier that it's hard for teachers to learn all of this new stuff and new information as they're trying to teach. And so that's really what Emily, or our instructional coach's role is to help our teachers acquire this new knowledge, but then also what that looks like in practice and how they can shift some of their practices to help meet the needs of students. And so their role is huge in this process, and they have done a fantastic job. We have Jody at Southview, and then we have Kayla up at the middle school, and they're on top of this. You know, they have also immersed themselves in learning more about the science of reading and how that then can influence our instruction moving forward.
Sure. So you look at our district mission of preparing every learner for success.
Yeah.
That's how that's happening at a very basic level with our youngest learners even.
Right.
So.
And I would always say, too, that we're not there, of course, but I am confident that every teacher that works anywhere in Marshall Public Schools only wants the best for all of our kids, and so they're going to do what it takes. So we just got to get there.
Right, absolutely. So thinking about all of this, I know I've heard you talk about gap in practice. And that goes back to kind of some old theory of teaching versus some new theory, and knowing we're never going to reach, but talk a little bit about that gap in practice.
So I'll give you an example. You know, when my youngest daughter was born, she had some issues that she was flown to Sioux Falls, a bigger hospital, and put into a NICU unit or whatever. And so when she was there, we were visiting with the nurses, and they had talked about how the research and science had evolved, that previously babies that were born early or that had problems, the plan was basically see if they survived overnight, and then if they survived, they would, you know, work with them to see if they could get them to survive. And that is not how it works anymore. The expectation is those babies are going to live. And so while that may be a little bit more dramatic, it's the same with the knowledge practice gap in education. They knew a lot about that, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, but it took a while. It took probably 15 to 20 years for the science to catch up with practice. Part of that is because, everybody has a differing thought and opinion, and it's hard to change. It's hard to change our thinking about what we thought we knew, and then how does that then impact what I thought I knew and what I'm doing currently. So.
Right. I think that's really exciting. So we used to talk, and the language we used just a couple years ago in the elementary rooms was about balanced literacy instruction. Yeah. So that's not gone. We're just learning more about reading and such. So talk a little bit about what the difference is between balanced literacy and some of the things that we're talking right now.
The science of reading calls for more structured literacy, and I would say that balanced literacy probably was more originally designed with whole language in mind. However, in Marshall, I wouldn't say that balanced literacy meets exactly the definition of balanced literacy. We've added pieces and components and parts that are, again, more in line with what the research says. And so that is kind of where we're at right now, is shifting that and moving from a balanced literacy approach, which again isn't a true definition of balanced literacy, how we're doing it, but shifting a little bit more to more of that direct and explicit teaching. So our balanced literacy currently, again, we have those small groups, but it's not just a reading group, but rather we're pulling in that phonics piece and reinforcing those skills.
Sure.
We do interactive read alouds, so assuring that all of our students hear grade level material and that we're talking about the standards for literacy, and that's where we're developing those skills. And so I see our balanced literacy shifting in some ways, but still having a lot of those same components with, again, that concentration of being very specific about phonics and instruction, about vocabulary development, about language development.
Sure. So it's a continual growth process, and as we know more, we do more, we do better. So.
Right, and we don't want to just take everything away that everybody's ever known, but rather there are just some very small shifts that we can be making. And right now our teachers are doing a book study. It's called Shifting the Balance, and so it's talking about how to apply the science of reading and that knowledge base to a balanced literacy classroom, and what those shifts look like and what those are.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. We're just about out of time, but the one other thing I want to mention, because I've heard you use the term really great reading.
Yes.
And while we think we do a really great job, that's not what that's talking about. So why don't you just share kind of what really great reading is?
Yeah, so last year we had a group of teachers that recognized that our phonics instruction wasn't systematic and explicit. So when I talk about systematic, that means that it's there's a progression and it follows that progression, and that it spirals. And then being very explicit, meaning it's very directly taught. It's not left to, for you to figure it out, or left to chance. It's very explicit. I do, you do, we all do it together. Yep. And so we bought a program. It's called Really Great Reading, and it's a phonics program that is implemented in all of our pre-K, K, and 1 classrooms. And it's about 20 minutes a day. But it's that phonics instruction, teaching kids to decode, helping them hear the sounds and then connecting the sounds with the letters.
It makes a lot of sense. So when we talk about really great reading, that's an actual thing that we're doing in the classroom, hoping that we make really great readers as we do it.
I know, right?
Right, that's awesome. Well, Darci, thank you so much for joining us today, and I want to thank all of our viewers for watching and paying attention and learning more about the science of reading. So thank you, everyone.